This bamboo is longer, more flexible, and very much alive. And when your flashy routine cannot keep up with the speed and elusiveness of this thing here, all I can say is that you will be in deep trouble.
Have your men stay as far away from the stairway as possible.
I go first!
I'm telling you, it is difficult to have a rehearsed routine to fit in with our own broken rhythm. Rehearsed routines lack the flexibility to adapt.
Help me! Help me!
Little fellow, you must have given up the hope of living.
On the contrary, I do not let the word death bother me.
Same here, baby.
Then what are you waiting for?
Game of Death hit cinemas in Hong Kong on the 23rd of March 1978 and got its US theatrical release in June of 1979. At the time, Bruce Lee had been dead for 5 years, so the director Robert Clouse invented a new story to incorporate the incomplete footage shot in 1972. Bruce in Death had become more popular and people were desperate to see more footage of their hero in action. Thus, Game of Death proved successful in Hong Kong, but it's unclear how it fared internationally. The original footage shot by Bruce Lee was pre-sold to Japan in the early 70s, and once Golden Harvest had completed the film to honour the deal, it did good numbers in Japan. It didn't get a big release throughout the world and only screened in a few territories, as far as I can see online. The BBFC had rated it an X in 1978, but it appears that it wasn't given as big of a commercial release as Enter the Dragon. Critics in English-speaking countries weren't kind on the movie. US critics especially felt it was in bad taste, and it was seen as exploiting the Bruce Lee name to make a quick profit. When Bruce Lee had passed away, many filmmakers in Hong Kong started producing knockoff movies, with actors pretending to be Bruce Lee, many with similar names or having exactly the same name. Lots of films appeared with similar titles to Enter the Dragon. Anything with dragon in the name with a Bruce Lee lookalike was common. People even began calling the phrase Bruceploitation, as the market was oversaturated with imitations. The yellow jumpsuit Bruce wears became his most famous outfit. Despite only featuring in the 1978 movie for a small amount of time, it demonstrated the powerful imagery of Bruce Lee. The outfit was borrowed in video games such as Tekken, and Quentin Tarantino used it prominently in Kill Bill Volume 1. After Game of Death came out, fans knew more footage existed of Bruce Lee's original vision for the movie, and they were right. The footage was lost for a long time in Golden Harvest's archive, and was eventually found, edited and released over 20 years later. It was still an incomplete film, but it demonstrated Bruce's intent and was even released in theatres in Japan to celebrate its discovery. The footage was eventually put on DVD and featured in the documentary A Warrior's Journey, and in a 2000 Japanese film titled Bruce Lee in God on DVD. The film was made as a tribute to Bruce Lee's Game of Death. It used archive footage from the original film and recreated scenes with stand-ins and the plotline of Bruce's own screen notes to bring us a more complete version of Lee's Game of Death. The discovered footage of course has been reissued on more recent releases of Game of Death to Blu-ray. Some scenes are also trimmed and the audio appears to have changed a bit, as they adjusted or made changes to some of the dialogue and sound effects. They didn't record any audio on the set in 1972, and everything was ADR'd later, so you have actors impersonating Bruce's voice and the other actors involved. Some of it works and some of it leaves a lot to be desired. 1972, Bruce Lee was at the height of his power in Hong Kong. His recent movie The Way of the Dragon had broken box office records and demonstrated that he could take on the role of director. Bruce was desperate to take creative control over his movies. After working under other directors for The Big Boss and Fist of Fury, he now had the chance to helm his own project. Bruce wrote, directed and starred in The Way of the Dragon, and he'll take on more responsibilities come Game of Death. The plot for Game of Death involves Lee playing the role of Hai Chen, a retired champion martial artist who is confronted by a Korean underworld gang. They tell him the story of a pagoda where guns are prohibited, and under heavy guard by highly skilled martial artists who are protecting an item at the top level, which is never revealed. People have their theories, but I can imagine it must be a valuable artifact. The gang boss wants Chen to be part of a group to retrieve the item. When Chen refuses, his younger sister and brother are kidnapped, forcing him to take part. Tien, as well as the other martial artists, two of whom played by James Chen and Get Yun, then fight their way up a 5-level pagoda, encountering a different challenge on each floor. Bruce's notes on developing the story changed a lot. For example, he had more martial artists joining him to work his way up the pagoda, who he encounters on the ground, first and second floor. The ground floor had the participants take on 10 people at once. The film was to showcase Lee's beliefs regarding the principles of martial arts. As each martial artist is defeated, including Lee's allies, the flaws in their fighting styles are revealed. Lee defeats his opponents by having a fighting style that involves fluid movement, which represents his new style of Jeet Kune Do. He adjusts his style of fighting to defeat his enemies, and when he reaches the top he encounters a style mirroring his own. Although the pagoda was supposed to have 5 floors, 6 if you include the ground floor, Bruce only completed scenes for floors 3 to 5 and nothing else, well, only insofar as what has been discovered and released. On the 3rd floor, Temple of the Tiger, Lee faced his close friend and student, Danny Santo. The 4th floor, Temple of the Dragon, he fought Jeet Zoi, and on the final floor he fights Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the Temple of the Unknown. The 1st floor was supposed to have the master of the kick-oriented style of Hapkido, and the 2nd floor Bruce was to have faced up against the style of Praying Mantis Kung Fu. Also, no ending was completed, so you don't know what he wins or the safety of his siblings. The then James Bond, George Lazenby, was intended to have a part in the film. George had come to Hong Kong on a whim, looking for work, and called up Golden Harvest. Raymond Chow was impressed that Bond was showing an interest in working with him. On Her Majesty's Secret Service was playing in theatres and doing well, so he was introduced to Bruce Lee and discussions began about him having a role in the film. The production was halted, however, when Bruce Lee was offered the lead in Warner Bros.' Enter the Dragon, the first collaboration between USA and Hong Kong filmmakers. He had noted in his diary that he would return to film Game of Death in September of 1973, but sadly he passed away in July. The day he died, he was supposed to meet Raymond Chow and George Lazenby to discuss Game of Death. Unfortunately, he never got to complete the film that could have been his best movie to date. After Bruce Lee died, Golden Harvest had this footage and didn't know what to do with it. Game of Death had already been pre-sold to Japan, so they had to think of a way to complete it. Robert Clouse, who directed Enter the Dragon, was hired to use the footage and write a new story around it. Many films had copied Bruce's original vision for Game of Death, and so they wanted to give the audience something new. Robert wrote the screenplay under the pseudonym of Jan Spears, and threw in some references to Bruce's own life, making certain scenes somewhat autobiographical. Robert wasn't really happy with what Bruce had shot back in 1972, and made the decision to use a limited amount of it. This may give you an indication that he was probably not the best person to be handling Bruce Lee's material. He only ended up using about 11 minutes of the original footage, while everything else was reshot to tell this new story. Raymond Chow and Robert Clouse wanted to get a number of actors who had worked with Bruce before, including his high-profile friends such as James Coburn and Steve McQueen playing cameos or filling in for new characters. Unfortunately, most of them turned it down, feeling that it was in bad taste, and also Golden Harvest wasn't paying that much. A few, however, did return, with Robert Wall, a villain in both The Way of the Dragon and Enter the Dragon. He plays kickboxer named Carl Miller. Sammo Hung, who appeared in Enter the Dragon, served as the fight coordinator for the reshoot of Game of Death, and is credited as the co-director in some prints of the movie. He also appears in a scene as the ring opponent for Miller. Sammo would reshoot a number of fight scenes as he felt what Robert had shot was subpar, and didn't match the quality of what was being produced in Hong Kong. To maintain continuity with the fight footage shot in 1972, Danny Santo was the only one to return to play as an additional enforcer for the Syndicate. They seemed to forget about Jeet Zoi. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar refused to participate in the reshoots, so they employed a double for his additional scenes. Although Chuck Norris is credited as starring in the film, his role is limited to clips from Way of the Dragon, inserted into the film for the movie's opening scenes. Chuck was not happy he was being advertised as starring in the film, and threatened legal action, but it was eventually settled out of court. 2 martial artists and 1 businessman who bore a resemblance to Bruce Lee were hired to double for him, with Kim Tai Chong aka Tang Long getting the most screen time. Tang would also return to play Bruce Lee in No Retreat, No Surrender. The doubles spend most of the film in disguises, usually involving false beards and large dark sunglasses that obscured the fact that they bore little resemblance to Lee. Robert Clouse shoots from certain angles to capture their familiarity to Bruce. It's funny, by the end of the movie it appears as though they can't be bothered to hide the fact that they are not Bruce Lee, and just avoid shooting from specific angles in order to capture what they need to complete the film. To add further to the illusion that what people were seeing was the real Bruce Lee, they throw in stock footage from his other movies, causing some hilarious continuity gaffes, and even using poor optical effects to create new scenes. It's some of the worst attempts at throwing in old footage to represent something new. It's hilariously bad. To incorporate the original footage, instead of setting it in a pagoda, they have the floors to be an extension of a restaurant that is owned by the Syndicate. They shot 3 different endings for the film that have played in certain territories. The common ending is to have Billy Lowe kill Dr. Land as he falls to his death off the restaurant. The next one had Billy being arrested for killing Dr. Land, while the other was seeing Billy and Anne leaving on the Star Ferry. So the plot for the 78 film focuses around Billy Lowe. Billy is dealing with a racketeering syndicate after gaining international success as a martial arts movie star. When Billy refuses to be intimidated by the syndicate henchman Steiner, played by Hugh O'Brien, who you may recognise from the movie Twins, he played Arnold's father. Syndicate owner Dr. Land, played by Academy Award winner Dean Jagger, who had starred in an early episode of the show Kung Fu, which was originally developed by Bruce Lee, orders his assassination to serve as an example to others. Disguised as a stuntman, Land's assassin Stick, played by Mel Novak, sneaks onto the set of Billy's new film, which is recreating the set of Fist of Fury, and uses the final scene for that film to cut to. Stick shoots Billy during the filming. A fragment of the bullet passes through Billy's face, leaving him alive but in need of plastic surgery, which alters his facial features. Billy uses this opportunity to fake his death. They actually use real footage of Bruce's funeral, the ultimate in bad taste, and then he disguises himself and takes revenge on each member of Dr. Land's gang. When the syndicate threatens and kidnaps his fiancée Anne Morris, played by Colleen Camp, Billy is forced to come out of hiding to save her. For the movie's international release, John Barry was hired to provide a new score to appeal to the US market. The original version had music by Roman Tam, which they felt wouldn't be suitable for markets outside of Hong Kong. Now, there are 2 stories on how John Barry got involved. One was that John thought it would be fun to do a Bruce Lee movie, and the other was that he didn't really want to do it. So he asked for a huge fee, expecting the producers to say no, but they agreed, so he had to do it. As it was the 70s, John was a tax exile due to the high rates in the UK, and was taking on any work that would come his way. Fans at the time didn't like the score. I believe the popular UK magazine Kung Fu Monthly said it was another boring John Barry score. Many fans felt that Lalo Schifrin, who composed Enter the Dragon, should have been brought back, as it appeared a number of the people involved in that production were attached to Game of Death, and it would have seemed a logical choice to have Lalo return. Maybe he was asked but declined due to the nature of the film and its exploitative methods. The score contains a lot of Barry's traditional scoring tropes. It sounds very much like a James Bond score of that period, and it opens the movie with a new credit sequence designed by Christopher Strong III. The main theme is very cool, but certainly lacks the funk and the power of Enter the Dragon's score. There's quite a bit of repetition throughout the soundtrack, as Barry calls upon the main theme a lot. There's a love theme for the character Lee and his girlfriend, which is a great piece of music. Barry can always effortlessly write love themes and emotional cues. You only need to listen to Somewhere in Time. That will make most people cry. The most interesting part of the score is when Bruce encounters Danny Santo on the first floor. I'm not sure if it's electronic in any way, but it seems like a new sound and kickstarts the original Bruce Lee footage. But unfortunately, once the music progresses onto the final floor against Kareem, it goes full on 70s with that Bond sound, so it doesn't quite fit. It's good music, but doesn't work as well as Enter the Dragon, which is one of my favourite scores. The score was released on LP at the time, featuring roughly 34 minutes of music, and later reissued on CD in 1991 with a couple of more tracks. The most common release to find on the second-hand market and on iTunes is the silver screen release. That features 2 scores by Barry, Game of Death and Night Games. Now, this score isn't available in any complete form, but many of Barry's earlier scores weren't very long. You would commonly find his scores hitting around the 40-minute mark, and the majority of what you hear in the film is on the CD. If you are a big fan of John Barry and the music in this film, then it's easily available on iTunes, but I would only recommend it if you are a hardcore fan. I don't think it's Barry's finest work. It does the job, but the music lacks the magic of his later scores, when he moved away from that familiar sound you hear in this soundtrack, and it doesn't quite fit Bruce Lee's image. Now, there was a sequel to Game of Death, imaginatively titled Game of Death 2. In some territories it was called Tower of Death or The New Game of Death. That was released in 1981 and aimed at the Japanese market, with additional scenes filmed there to appeal to that audience. This film has no connection to the original 1978 film, and is only connected by the English dub, that the character Bobby Lowe, who was the brother of Billy Lowe from the first film and is played by the same actor. So Kim Tai-chong plays Billy and Bobby. It also makes use of a deleted scene from the 78 Game of Death, where Billy Lowe has a fight in a greenhouse. The film uses one main scene of Bruce Lee taking a deleted scene from Enter the Dragon near the beginning of the film, but also uses alternative takes and deleted moments from that movie to create new scenes. Eventually, over the years, this scene was put back into the DVD release of Enter the Dragon, making this sequel even less connected to Bruce Lee than it should be. They even throw in footage from the old films Bruce starred in as a kid. This is bananas, but to give them credit, when they do throw in stock footage, it actually blends more seamlessly than the 78 film. They really worked the production to fit the stock footage, whereas the 78 film was totally careless and lazy. For the plot, Billy Lowe, famed martial artist, is murdered, and again they use footage of Bruce's funeral. Dear oh dear, they have no shame. His brother Bobby goes to Korea and discovers an underground pagoda. He finds his brother's killers and exacts revenge. The fighting in this film is superb. It all goes all sci-fi as he works his way down into the underground base, fights a lion, well basically someone dressed up in a poorly made suit, and the whole film just goes crazy with its execution. It is a lot of fun, and it's a shame it was marketed as a sequel to Game of Death. It should have just been its own thing. It's far better than the Robert Klaus movie. If you love proper kung fu flicks with lengthy elaborate fight scenes, this will certainly please you. I first stumbled upon Game of Death after picking up the VHS box set from Forefront Video, which was a common find during the 90s in the UK. I was first introduced to Bruce Lee through Enter the Dragon, and I was blown away, like most of us, and wanted more. Sadly, there was only 3 other completed movies and Game of Death. Now at the time I thought Game of Death was complete, and just another action flick in his filmography, but as soon as the opening credits have finished you instantly see problems. The filmmakers really tried to create a new story to accommodate the limited footage that Bruce had originally shot, but it falls flat on its arse. It just comes across as embarrassing and ultimately exploitative crap. It opens straight away with the movie's most glaring and feeble attempts to put Bruce Lee into it. A hilarious cutout of Bruce's head optically slapped over new footage. Cutaways to old footage creating some of the worst continuity in film history. Opening the movie in such a way seems totally bonkers. They show off their worst attempts. You'd think maybe try the techniques a bit later on and not straight out the gate, causing some laughable results within 10 minutes. They clearly realised that it didn't work and avoided using any optical tricks throughout the remainder of the movie. Using actual footage of Bruce's funeral is an appalling and tasteless attempt to create a story around the character Billy Lowe faking his own death. This was a conspiracy theory at the time. Many in the press and fans felt that Bruce had indeed faked his own death in 1973, as they couldn't come to terms with how he died. Robert Klaus just lazily throws that conspiracy into the plot of the movie. I find it totally baffling that Klaus took the hardest route to integrate Bruce Lee's original footage. He said that he'd changed the plot due to many other filmmakers in Hong Kong cinema having already copied the original concept for Game of Death, so he wanted to do something different. This is a perfect reason to move in a different direction, but ultimately the audience wouldn't care if the plot wasn't original now due to many copycats. They wanted to see Bruce Lee in action, and that's it. The plot is the least of the audience's concerns. There was about 50 minutes of footage that was usable from what Bruce had shot in '72. There may be more, but let's just say that amount for argument's sake. So Robert would only have to complete an additional 40 minutes to make up 90 minutes in order to have a finished movie. He could have just shot the 2 remaining floors of the pagoda, the intro to kickstart the plot, and the prize Bruce Lee eventually finds after defeating Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. It's interesting to read about the actors who were friends of Bruce Lee and were asked to get involved. While most politely declined, feeling it was in bad taste, others such as Bob Wall and Sammo Hung happily contributed. I suppose the way they saw it, it was a chance to get the remaining footage of Bruce Lee out there for everyone to see, and of course people need to pay the bills and continue working. Everyone else Robert Klaus cast to fill in for the new characters had no relation to Bruce. They never knew him, and they are not martial artists either. It surrounds this great footage Bruce shot back in '72 with a bunch of actors who would never appear in one of his movies if he was still alive, which seems somewhat creatively bankrupt. I suppose it was just Robert getting desperate to fill these roles, and resorting to having to get a number of B players in the industry to take part at the time. Now this movie has a lot of bad stuff in it, and is fundamentally a waste of time in my eyes. It's a guilty pleasure for many as it falls into that category of being so bad it's good, and there are many moments to get some good belly laughs, as you scoff at its execution. But there are a couple of good fight scenes in it thanks to Sammo Hung, who choreographed some fun and interesting fights. You see Sammo Hung take on Bob Wall in the ring, and then when he makes his way to the locker room, Billy Lowe attacks Bob Wall. It's well covered, they do their best to hide the actor's face as much as possible, and it tries to keep in the style of what Bruce did in terms of fighting. As Billy Lowe takes on many of the Syndicate's thugs early on, it generally works, but that's about it for me. The bike chase sequence in the warehouse where Billy gets the famous yellow jumpsuit is overly long and drawn out. The whole film has this plodding feel to it, with many scenes of the new characters on the telephone. You know a filmmaker is trying to speed up the shoot to deliver loads of information for the audience when they film people on the phone. The photography is nicely shot in some places. It looks more polished than say some of Lee's previous movies, which showed their budget limitations, so it essentially looks like a well-made TV movie. It's just the whole nature of it seems wrong, and I imagine that the estate of Bruce Lee weren't entirely happy with it at the time. I'm sure over the years though it's just seen as this silly movie that happened, and what with all the knockoffs during the 70s, the nature of it probably didn't seem that bad. If Game of Death was completed and the production wasn't halted at the time, would it have been Bruce's best movie to date? I think in terms of martial arts action it would have been the best. In The Big Boss, Fist of Fury and The Way of the Dragon, we the audience are just waiting for him to let loose and beat the crap out of people. With Game of Death there is a strong indication that the action would have kicked in very early on, as he fights his way to the top of the pagoda, but I do think it would have been thin on story. What we have available, there isn't much dialogue, and what we are given are a few lines from Bruce about his philosophies on martial arts. His dialogue often includes comments on the opponent's weaknesses. The plot may have been front-loaded to give us enough of a story to warrant the extended fighting, so if you compared this with Enter the Dragon, we may have preferred that movie's story over Game of Death. But at the end of the day, we watch these movies mainly for the fighting, so Game of Death may well have been the one we would have gone back to more often for a rewatch. When you see the new cut of Game of Death and compare it to the 78 version, there is a difference in its colour grading. I honestly think the colour timing is more in line with what Bruce had shot. The yellow jumpsuit remains yellow throughout the 78 cut, and in the newly discovered footage, the suit turns slightly orange, so there could be a problem with the print because of how it was stored over the years, or who had transferred it to video didn't quite match the colours correctly. The 78 cut also has stronger blacks, so it generally is visibly more appealing to the eyes. When the footage was first discovered and released, they showed it on UK TV. I think they actually broadcast the Warrior's Journey documentary on Channel 4. It was mind-blowing to see them showing it and not having to resort to a DVD to watch it. It felt special that a popular channel had dedicated time to show this newly discovered footage. When I first saw it, it was incredible seeing what Bruce had intended for the story, and the lengthy nunchuck fight and seeing how he defeats Kareem at the end by blinding him when he is exposed to light. For me, it was the same feeling I had when I finally saw the Marlon Brando footage that was intended for Superman 2. There are always fans of a community who will say there is more footage hiding in a vault or wherever, and in some cases it borders on the obsessive. I can hold my hands up and say I've been in that position before. People think you are making stuff up or talking rubbish, but in most cases the fans who state there is more material are often right. It's the fans who research this stuff and do the digging to get the word out there to the masses, to inform the public there is more footage available than we are led to believe. I think most Bruce Lee fans tend not to take the 78 movie seriously and only watch it as a guilty pleasure, as I highlighted earlier. I often tend to watch it only with Bay Logan's audio commentary that came with the old Hong Kong Legends release, which is very informative. If you want to watch Game of Death, then you have to watch the 40-minute cut, which you can look upon as a short movie, with visual effects coming along leaps and bounds in modern cinema that can make actors look young, or even have actors that have passed away return for a movie. They may one day complete Bruce's original vision with CGI. That would be interesting, but then you have the same problem of the 78 film, exploiting him to make money. The intention may be to preserve this footage or give it a new lease of life, but it's often best to leave it alone and just see it as a window into what could have been. What we have is perfectly fine, and I'm just happy that I got to see more of Bruce Lee in action. This remaining footage should be cherished and preserved how it is.
As you gentlemen know, red means danger. Therefore, I advise to you people not to step into this warning arena. If you want to go on living, start here. Go back downstairs. Life is precious.
Why continue? Just let me pass.
You have forgotten that I too am not afraid of death.
If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to gain early access to my retrospective reviews, episodes of Fix It in Post and commentary podcasts, you can pledge to my Patreon. Thank you.